Okay, Raleigh, out my seat. Yes, you can have your biscuit. No more day, okay? Good boy. Out my seat. Man of times I have to wrestle a poodle for my seat. Right, now let's check the sound levels. So, headphones on. Okay, someone has just raided. Oh no, John of Moon has 16 months subscription. And I can hear that. Hello everyone. Hello. Raleigh, did you press any buttons while you were on here, up on this in this chair? Because it appears to me, and I'd just like to point this out, that the camera has moved from where I set it up earlier. There's just something which is suggesting to me that the camera is now focused with you, when you're positioned dead center, and me kind of peering into the screen. Hello everyone, let's see if we can't move this. No, you're not getting any more. Hello everyone. Right then. There we go. Hello! How are we all doing? So, tonight's video, we are live, okay? This is a live video. I'm saying this because there is still, and I can't believe it after the news, people who watch a live video and are surprised it is a live video and I respond to the chat. I know I put out an awful lot of recorded videos, and so it's very easy to get the idea that all my videos are recorded. Especially as I do premieres, so the chat is often a feature even when they're recorded videos. But yeah, sometimes they're lives, and this is one of them. Yeah, and I've already noticed that you've put the comment already on the premiere, which is not due to come out till, I think it might be February next year. I know I'm uploading quite a lot of them right now. Right, today is going to be an interesting question. And I have to admit, both this and the other live, which made it through to November, I was tempted to say no dice to. For different reasons. I was tempted to say no dice to the one that's Richard Vasava's question of what would a Chinese invasion of Taiwan look like, because it is a massive speculation, but I'm going to treat it as a war studies exercise, which I've taught through students many times, and I'm going to explain it as that. So basically, I'm going to use it as a hypothetical exercise, like I would with my students. So it's entirely a conjecture and logic train. It's not... There's no history for me to really base it on, because of... The fact is, we're dealing with forces which are... It's a very different circumstance than the Falklands would be, a very different circumstance, all these other operations, because it's not a D-Day style operation, because it's actually a little bit more difficult distance than that, but it also, it's not really amphibious, it is closer to D-Day than an amphibious assault. And then there's this question. The navies are the major powers in the 1950s if World War II did not happen. Now, this almost got chucked away because, frankly, it is too far and too much of a difference of history that it is entirely logical. Entirely logic-based. But the thing is, we have plans which go well into the 1940s from some of the building plans. You have Plan Z from the Germans, which... Their plans, basically, if you consider the rate of their production and their infrastructure issues, and their funding issues, we could be talking about a plan which goes to the 1950s itself. So, yeah, this is going to be an interesting one. There's also the fact that there are some classes, like, for example, the Maltas, which come about in wartime. Yes, they are progressions of thinking, but they're also progressions of wartime experience. So they wouldn't happen. So basically, you're subtracting some of the wartime experience from the progression. And that's not just the British affected by that, that's going to be the Americans, it's going to be lots of nations affected by it. So yeah, this is going to be an interesting one. This is going to be a very much a question of discussion. And that's why I've already done the premiere. Because I thought this is going to be one which is going to be a bit of a discussion with the chat. So basically, you've got one which is purely my opinion, my logic train, and my discussion. And in this one, which is going to be very much responsive with the chat as we're going through. Okay? With that being said, how did this happen and which navies are we talking about? Now, that's an interesting question to start off with. And that's an important question to start off with, because which navies count as major navies? Now, I decided to go to USA, Great Britain, Japan, France, Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union for this one. I decided that rather fitted. And Great Britain I'm basically using to include the entirety of the British Empire, because my theory is that the Commonwealthization probably continues, and what Britain referred to as the Dominionization of the empire continues. I don't see it suddenly going, we're going to get rid of the empire. And I don't see it really breaking up under these conditions either. And especially, as Britain rearms, a lot of those worries in Australia and other parts of the empire, which are worried whether Britain is going to defend them anymore, are going to be reduced because Britain will be rearming. And it's an interesting thing to put into that perspective as the case of, if Britain's rearming and they're being rearmed along with Britain, then the Dominionization and the Commonwealthization of the empire probably continues more to the original plan and scaling and time frame. And it's not going to go perfectly, but it's probably, for the timeline we're talking about till about 1950, I don't see it suddenly falling apart in that period. There are stresses, there are problems in it, but there's also a lot of things which are for it rather than against it, and in this period, those things will be working for it. I also, if we're talking about the how of this all, my theory basically is the easiest way is, well, when Hitler was going into the Rhineland, he said if the British and the French mobilized to withdraw. There didn't even need to be a war. The British and French just needed to mobilize, and he was planning to withdraw from the Rhineland. So the British and French mobilize when he goes into the Rhineland. He'll withdraw. And if Hitler withdraws from the Rhineland, that's going to put back his plans of preparing for war and war plans a fair chunk. He's going to start having to redouble efforts. Does that mean war doesn't happen? No, we'll get into that. With both Britain and the USA building up, and no war distraction, Japan's leadership might decide that the northern resource area, i.e. their war versus the Soviet Union again, remember they are at war with the Soviet Union in such a manner that the reason the Soviet Union are delayed in invading Poland in comparison to the German invasion of Poland is because they're waiting till they finish getting a peace deal signed with the Japanese, so they don't get distracted by being attacked in Siberia while they're fighting in Europe. Yeah, so, nice guy, Stalin. Really nice guy. So leaving all that to one side, Does this mean no wars at all? Well, I think just because World War II doesn't happen doesn't mean there's no conflicts. There are probably smaller conflicts, and the German economy, for it to be able to stagger along, it needs war. It needs some support. But that might be Germany entering the Winter War on the side of Finland and conducting operations against the Soviets, or without invading Poland, or maybe on the side of Poland. There have been stranger things in history. Let's be honest. Sometimes when you're reading the history books out to people, they think that they don't. That it's unbelievable because it's stranger than fiction is often the case. Well, yeah, there is a possibility that a winter war where Germany's sort of supporting Finland more leads to Soviet bombers trying to fly over Poland, leads to a Finnish, Polish, German war against the Soviets. There are all sorts of options, but it doesn't need to be a world war, i.e. it doesn't need to be a war taking place in Europe, North Africa, and Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, simultaneously, as well as the Indian Ocean, Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, and basically all around the world. It doesn't need to be a world war. And let's be honest, smaller wars, they're going to be learning experiences, but they're not going to have the same learning, same connotations as a full-blown major conflict. They won't. They also won't have the same logistical and infrastructure reproductions and the same damage potential. And also, they don't necessarily involve all the major powers getting involved. They don't necessarily involve all the major powers or require all the major powers to get involved. So that's the sort of scenario we're discussing. And yes, Hitler would need something if he does have to withdraw from the Rhineland. But the thing is, if he has to withdraw from the Rhineland because Britain and France mobilise, then he realises that, frankly, war with them might not be sensible. The really interesting scenario in this is he might end up with war between Germany and Italy over Austria. And there's also scenarios in terms of the Far East where if the Japanese decide to focus on the Soviets and are attacking the Soviets, it could be the Anti-Comintern Pact ends up involving more than just Germany and Japan and Finland and maybe even Poland in this scenario. There's all sorts of options for how that could work out. Now, the thing is, Hitler's still probably going to do all the stuff he does on domestic policies. He's still going to be persecuting the Jews. But without a war, it's easier for the Jews to leave Germany and Jews to leave German-controlled area, as same for gypsies and other people who were persecuted as part of the Holocaust. The Jews were a large number of the majority, but there were others as well. It's not easy for them to get out, but it's easier. And it's arguable that a lot of National Socialist policy earlier on was meant to eradicate the problem by the easiest method possible. And the easiest method possible was to encourage everyone to leave. By the way, it's not because they were any nicer. It's just it was easier. It was easier. Persecute the ones who stay and try and get as many to leave as possible. There are lots of powder kegs for small conflicts, is the point I'm making. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a massive conflict. There doesn't necessarily need to be a world war. Now, to be honest, my thinking here is that if the World War doesn't happen in the 1940s, and these powers keep on even with smaller conflicts, you're going to have something in the 1950s. You're not going to get dictatorships enjoying being second and being in third, fourth, fifth place to large democratic powers for that long. And the problem is that even, the fact is France building up, given a decade to build up, is going to become massively stronger than either of the European dictatorships due to their economic model and their links. Let's be honest, autarky is an interesting economic model for Germany to be pursuing, and Italy has its own issues. Italy has its own issues. And tech level is going to keep going up and up. It is. So that being said, how have I done this discussion? Have I done it fleet by fleet? No. Okay? The discussion is going to be group of ships by group of ships by group of ships. And I think that makes sense. I think that makes sense because what we're going to be talking about, a lot of this is going to be a bit of an arms race going on and a bit of a constant discussion, debate, and what navies want out of ships themselves is also going to be as they break free from the treaties at slightly different times and the different industrial capacities. If it's in America's got to build up its industry to start building up, get it to the head, and it will do, but what will it build up its industry for? As we know, historically, until war actually happens, the Senate are very bad at ordering certain types of vessels. They'll lead it to one side. There is also, before we get too far into it, of course, the question of atomic weapons, which very quickly this video could become all about. But one of the things about the atomic weapons research in World War II is that World War II forces a lot of nations to pool their research, which reveals that a lot of nations are close but no cigar. They are close but no cigar in their own ways. And whilst, yes, time could well fix that, time and funding, I don't think it's going to see it probably till the 50s, because there just isn't the pressure there. And the reason is because whilst it might seem absolutely completely abnormal to us today, quite a lot of nations have a massive stockpile of biological weaponry. And so, kind of like, why does Germany not use its biological weapons on Britain during World War II? Because they know the British stockpile is bigger and nastier. And no one wants it to come back. And so, to an extent, this is one of the problems I have with the concept of mutually assured destruction preventing conventional war. There was mutually assured destruction in World War II between the major powers. It didn't prevent major war. They all had biological weapons. They all had the means to deploy them. They still went to war and beat each other up for several years, and thousands upon thousands of people died. Millions of people died. So my theory is, in this scenario, nuclear weapons will be being developed. Will they have ended service by the time we're talking about 1950? Doubtful. Doubtful. But they'll probably be getting closer. Lots of weapons were going to be the weapons to end all wars, weren't they, Big Fluff? They were. Unfortunately, for all the people who predicted it, it never happened, eh? There again, though, it did allow for the rise of Darth Cananis. Oh, God! Ah! Sif taking over! Sif taking over! Oh, good lord. Get now. Good lord. So, let's talk about battleships. Now, the first things first is this. The amount of times I read, they shouldn't have been building battleships in the 1930s, carriers were the way of the world. Or various things along the lines of, carriers, why build battleships, carriers. The thing is, if you talk to any admiral in 1930, or in 1935, you can beg all you like, you ain't getting anything. Nope. If you talk to any of the admirals involved, they'll tell you carriers are the coming future. But they haven't arrived yet. They haven't got there yet. And the thing is, when you're a nation state, you don't take risks. You don't risk national security. You don't take the risk. So what do? You build an aircraft carrier, you also build a battleship. You build the battleship as well as the aircraft carrier. So you have both. Because the battleship is the decisive weapon of today. The aircraft carrier is the decisive weapon of sometime in the future. Maybe it's tomorrow. Maybe it's a week on Tuesday. You don't know. You know it's coming, but if you look at the aircraft, especially the aircraft available in 1930, 1935, even the aircraft on most carriers in 1939, you are not going to be thinking this is the decisive weapon at the moment. It's coming, it's not there yet. So expect capital ships to still be being built. The odds are, and I would put this forward, there's going to be two criteria which are going to come in. One, 28 knots is going to become the minimum speed. I'm sorry, Yamatos are going to be too slow at 27 knots, but everyone's going to be aiming for 28 knots or higher. You're going to probably get a batch of fast battleships of about 28 knots, varying up till about 32 knots, and then faster than that are going to be things which are fully armoured battlecruisers like the Vanguard. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Vanguards, especially because, let's be honest, the Vanguard has a very big advantage over the King George V. One, it comes from a separate design study. Two, it's actually designed, it's codified after the treaties have been formally left. So it sort of, when someone turns around and goes, well, actually, no, the Vanguard is a fast battleship. The Vanguard isn't a fast battleship. It's a fully armoured battlecruiser. It's made to battlecruiser as they were considered standards of subdivision and hull structure, but it's got a full armour profile, hence fully armoured battlecruiser, not fast battleship. Fast battleship is King George V's in subdivision, but of course the King George V's are built under treaty limitations. We don't have a fast battleship built by the British outside of the treaty limitations. Not happening. No. And so there is the differential going on. But even then, in the King George V, there is a huge difference between how King George V is completed and how Anson and Howe are completed. There are modifications going on. And if the Lions had been built, they'd have been different still. Again, you have the same when you start to look about the Americans. They're going to be building there, and they've got their plans. And they've got their structures. But the thing that interests me most, for all the nations involved, doesn't matter whether it's Italy, Germany, the Soviet Union, France, Britain, America. The moment it comes out that Japan has 18-inch armed battleships, doesn't matter how good the 18-inch gun is, there are going to be problems. You're going to have to respond. Now, to my mind, probably the easiest and quickest way for both Britain and America to respond, considering the designs they have on their stocks and being constructed in 1939, is going to be, let's go for a 12, 16-inch gun ship. Potentially, the British yonk the 16.5-inch gun, which they've been toying on, the 16.5-inch gun design, they've been toying with since about 1918, on and off, out of Ellswick, and build that. and go and do a modified up to 12 16.5-inch guns. I could see the Royal Navy doing that. Why? Purely to guarantee they could kick something which is 18-inch guns behind. Because let's be honest, 12 16.5 versus 9/18. Rate of fire is going to be the 16.5. 18 is the next level rate of fire. 16.5 is about the highest. You can get roughly 2 rounds a minute. Inconsistent. And yeah, you go for something. But it's also going to affect others. For example, imagine Herr Hitler opens his morning paper with that punctilious moustache going on, you know. Looking at it going, what? Japan has 18-inch guns on their battleships? Imagine the ego. I mean, literally, it's hard enough for Raider to get decent funding for the Navy out of Goring. It's hard enough for them to get the money coming into the Navy to try and build a balanced Navy, which is, you know, my main argument against Plan Z ever working isn't a nicest way. It isn't that Germany isn't technologically capable of doing it once they've rectified all the damage done by the Treaty of Versailles to their naval maritime infrastructure. No, the problem with it is getting consistent funding to actually build that force and consistent supplies when there is priority goes Luftwaffe, for Goering goes Luftwaffe, his pet dog, his wine cellar, the army, paintings of himself, buying huge vast quantities of drugs, and then the Navy. That's the scenario. That's what you're dealing with. And so, if your budget is further skewed because the moustache gentleman wants something very expensive done very quickly to match him with the Japanese, you're going to have a problem. It's going to be the same with Mussolini. In fact, it's going to be the same with every other dictator. Imagine Stalin. Imagine Stalin's response. This is going to be a nightmare. And the trouble is, you're not going to have to deal just responding to the Japanese. You're going to have to deal responding to the responses. Now, the thing is, because Britain and America have larger, consistent programs going, they are going to be the quickest to respond. You're going to have 2 generations of your response. You're going to have the initial, what we can quickly build, response. And then you're going to have the status response. The status response is going to be something with at least 12 18-inch guns, which is going to come up at some point. However, again, the Japanese were planning on jumping even bigger. Yes, the Japanese were planning on going even bigger than this. And if they do, that's going to be problems. That's going to be an issue. Because the bigger they go, the bigger everyone else is going to have to go. And as you're going bigger, and you're building a ship to withstand these things, you're also going to have to build it to probably build it better and better air defences and better other systems as well, as you're learning them. Which is going to have an impact, therefore, on the viability of carrier aircraft versus battleships. In the perceptions. Might not in the reality, but in the perception of those looking at them. And this is an interesting scenario. And people are already putting in the chat, well, if Hitler wants a super battleship, that's what Goering's going to give them. Yes, they'll probably get the funding for the super battleship. But what will that funding come from? Will it mean they don't get the submarines built they want to, the destroyers they want to, the cruisers they want to? This is the thing. If you are building those things and you're not getting limited supplies from the various parts of the government that are supposed to supply you to give you the materials you need, Are you going to get are you going to get the balanced force? Probably not. Now, there is an interesting question here, of course. Matthew Keeling, of course, depends on the Japanese not completely exhausting their territory trying to conquer China. Yeah, the thing is, the Japanese are in many ways in a worse economic situation than anyone else. They're also in a better economic situation than others. Because there are two things which work to their advantage. One, a Britain not involved in a European war might actually sell them fuel. They might. Why might they sell them fuel? Well, if Britain isn't worrying about facing off against Germany imminently, because Hitler's just backed off in the Rhine on the moment they mobilised, then if Japan is fighting against the Soviet Union, keeping the Soviet Union busy, rather than looking at India or looking at Europe, becomes very attractive to Britain. And whilst America and Britain might not like Japan doing stuff in China, they don't. Let's be honest, Britain has a long and storied history of finding ways to get funds to people who can keep others who are more annoying to them busy. A lot more. Now, the other fun thing you have going on here is investments in infrastructure, of course. And all this will lead to investments in infrastructure. All that will be going on. So realistically, you have a lot of potential efforts going into this. I still think 16 to 16.5 inch guns is the sweet spot for a battleship gun. I really do. But if some people have super massive battle wagons, everyone will want to have some super massive battle wagons. And this is the interesting point, because people have already been chatting about multiple Vanguards coming into service. In a world where suddenly you're looking at capital ships requiring wielding 18-inch guns and multiple 12, 16-inch guns as standard, is something with 8 15-inch guns going to be considered a useful battle wagon? What do you all think? How useful is 8 15-inch guns in a world where 12, 16, 16.5-inch guns are the entry? I'm waiting for the chat. Be interested to see what you all say. Be interested to see what you all think. Do 8 15-inch guns still be helpful? Will they still be of use? Would they? And Knight 681, here's the question. You said, well, Vanguard's be more useful for Europe than the Pacific, to be honest. Would they? Vanguards are maneuver warfare assets. They are not stand and fight assets. It's a fully armoured battle cruiser. And that's the thing is, at a certain point, when we haven't got into the cruisers yet, the Vanguards in their original design suddenly don't become all that useful. And the thing is, does Britain want to waste a slipway building battleships which are no use to it? I think myself, if Vanguard does get built in this scenario, she's a one and done. I don't think there are multiples of them. I don't think it's going to be a likely scenario where they have lots of these vessels. Because I think the 15-inch 42 quickly finds itself outclassed, and I think quickly it's a case of, okay, 8 guns is not enough for a battleship. Or a battlecruiser. Vanguard was the measure you were taking to rapidly... Vanguards were part of the measures you were taking to rapidly build battleships up to a strength by which you need at least 24 battleships by 1942. There are other options. And as said, 15-inch 42s could well find themselves being used for harbour defence guns. Because if you can mount a 15-inch 42 somewhere where it can get a 45-degree angle or higher of elevation, that's very useful. That's very useful, but you can't achieve that on the sea deployments. I know, there's been discussions on Twitter recently about the penetrating angles, and sometimes the shot you get from battleships is going, this shell must have been coming in at this angle, and it's a case of, really? Because it's fired at, like, maximum height is 15 degrees, so... not really. Well, Dan Haas... The thing is, Renown did fill line of battle weapon. She was line of battle. Until about 1943, 44. That's when she starts to fall into second line duties. Especially if they're updated. I think they go for... I think it'd be fast battleships. I honestly think... The reason given for Vanguards being a one and done would be this is not a battle cruiser. This is not. There's no longer a battle cruiser world. It's a fast battleship world, and the entrance speed is going to be 28 knots. And if you think about that, a ship that can do 28 knots and carries 12, 16.5-inch guns versus a ship that can do, yeah, I can do 32 plus knots and I carry 8 15-inch guns. Which sounds more impressive. And also, you've got the growth of carriers. And that's going to be the next area. It's going to be naval aviation. And this is going to be really interesting. Really, really interesting. Because the thing is... yes, you're going to get bigger and larger carriers. Expect the Implacables to become sort of the baseline of the Royal Navy carrier design. After all, they're 27,000 tons designed. They are armoured flight decks, but they're also designed to carry the air group that's required of a strike carrier. So they are emerging of the fleet carrier and the strike carrier roles into one carrier. They expect that to be the continuation on. So expect them to sort of be grown and improved versions of that. You could very quickly, next generation of them could be deck edge lifts. There were some deck edge lift designs going around the Royal Navy. Henderson might dies in 1939, but someone who properly succeeds him properly and gets involved is probably going to look at them and go, well, hang on, if we move the lifts to the deck edge, A, we stop having an armour weakness in the middle of the deck, which helps protect the ship, and B... this is a big important, we get a lot more space for aircraft stowage for our size. Now, that's going to have an interesting thing of if you've got the second hangar down below, you don't necessarily want the hangar to the lift to go all the way down. What you might do is have an internal lift which goes up and down between the two hangars, That's fine. And have a deck edge lift which goes down to the main hangar, and you use the sort of second hangar as your maintenance space. And what they might end up doing is raising the height of the lower hangar to make it a maintenance space, so it's got all the space you need for maintenance and heavy duty maintenance of that. And then it doesn't matter so much the height of the upper hangar being the lower height. Now, I could see that happening in the Royal Navy. I could see the US Navy carrying along. Don't expect the Essex Swarm to be ordered. It's not going to be an Essex Swarm. There's going to be a lot of Essexes ordered, but probably not the same swarm as there was historically. But they're probably going to move on to midways. And as I've always said, the midways are more of a midways are more a continuation of the Yorktown than they are an Essex. A Midway is more of an armoured Yorktown design than an Essex. An Essex is a stripped down Yorktown for mass production. A Midway is a Yorktown, we've got no treaty limits. We can now build something with armour like we've always wanted to. Because you always have to remember, both the Royal Navy and US Navy wanted the same thing out of their dream carrier. It's just, due to the geostrategic differences of their operating scenarios, they had to accept different concessions. Now, there is an interesting thing already brought up by the chat. Light fleet carriers. Now, historically, the Royal Navy is already producing the Unicorn as a forward aviation support ship. I think if they do see a proliferation of carriers happening, especially amongst other powers, what you might see is a class of light fleets ordered as a way to buy them time to get more carriers into service. Basically, you order the light fleets, first off to equip the Royal Navy and allow them to rapidly expand the fleet air arm, and then you hand them over to the Dominions. Because let's be honest, light fleet carriers versus full fleet carriers, they can probably take the light fleets far more quickly than they can the full fleet carriers. And so that's the sort of thing you could see happening. You could see a whole generation. The Americans probably never get any light carriers and are always going for full fat carriers, because let's be honest, their experience of trying to build light carriers has been terrible. In fact, in a nicest way, whilst Hornet will probably survive, whilst Wasp will probably survive a while, Ranger will be gone within 5 minutes. Ranger will be gone as soon as King can kick her out of the Navy. But the thing is, which powers getting involved in this carrier race, it's going to be interesting. I can see others getting involved. Let's be honest, the Graf Zeppelin might actually come into service under this scenario, which is going to cause feathers to be ruffled. It's also probably going to cause quite a few people to be less concerned about it than they are with it on paper, because once they see it operating in practice, they're going to look at it and go, that's some really inventive ideas. Good luck getting them all to work. That'll be about a decade. Have fun. And in this scenario, you're going to get a lot more construction going on. A lot more construction. I would also expect to see jet aircraft in service from carriers by the 1950s. I would expect to see jet aircraft operating on carriers. Britain's already heading in a direction. The Royal Navy is one of the Royal Navy Fleet Air is one of the first to be interested in jet aircraft. There's an argument they actually get there before the Air Ministry. I would not be surprised if you have jets, and therefore potentially you have angled flight decks appearing as they did historically. King might be retired as he was historically, but he might not be. You have to remember, Roosevelt was hunting around for someone like King to reform and grow the Navy. And there is a chance. Neutrality patrols also. There's all the small wars that are potentially going to be going on as well. There's lots of options which could see him survive. It might not, but even King's successors are similar. There's no one coming into the senior ranks of the US Navy who likes Ranger enough that they're going to want to hold on to it. There really isn't. Now, I do see, but there's a lot of people already presuming it's going to be Centaurs and various things that are like fleet carriers. I don't think so. You have to remember, the light fleet carrier as it came out in wartime was in many ways a barely modified unicorn design. I think in peacetime you've got far more chance to add bells and whistles. I'd expect to see there being a bit more armour included in design. And it's going to depend. If the deck edge version of the deck edge lift version of the Implacables come out first, then the light fleet carriers probably get deck edge lifts, and then that's going to change their capacities and their design as well. So you can't really think of any design coming out exactly the same as it did historically, which isn't already under construction in 1939. Angled flight decks aren't needed for prop aircraft because of the landing speeds, etc. of the aircraft. But the moment you're getting into operating jets, especially jets if you're operating them at night, which, let's be honest, is enough of a Royal Navy fixation that they're going to be continuing doing, and other navies might have joined them by that point, it's going to be something that they're going to be heading towards. But it's not really necessary for prop aircraft. And yeah, Knight 6831, I don't see why you're presuming Roosevelt's going to be out of office by 1941. I would never presume Roosevelt is out of office by 1941. He's a very canny politician. He'll find a way to getting to keeping power. And frankly, looking at his opponents, they can come close, but I don't think they're going to win against him. He'll probably die in office like he did historically. But again, one of the points about this question, and before you wander off too much, is that we're talking about the navies. And this is one of the reasons why I'm not getting into specifics of class and construction and all these things too much details, because that's all a whole load of the weeds, and it's over our remit discussion. And also, it does start to require for these people to be in office and this person to be making decisions here, there, and everywhere. And, you know, honestly, things can change. Things can change. And it's like your discussion of the AA guns. Well, this is going to all depend upon the exercise, and I'll talk about them in a second. So, basically, we'll get to that. Before we get to that, the sort of talking about carriers, and we've talked about jet engines, we've also got to talk about wackier aircraft ideas. Yes, things like the Fleet Shadower. Now, the reason I brought out the Fleet Shadower as a specific example is because one of the things it was going to be fitted with was the ASV radar, the air surface radar. And if you've got a large enough radar, and they were working on them already, the British already were working on those radars, then this actually aircraft, as well as being a night shadow aircraft, which is supposed to stalk an enemy fleet in the middle of the night, so the Royal Navy get close to... Basically, the Royal Navy's plan and night fighting doctrine can be best described as this. close the knife fighting range of your enemy, and open up with a cannon. Okay? So basically, get to the point at which you could stab them, and then go, here's a rather large amount of high explosive. Enjoy. This was part of it. Now, the thing is, if you've got an aircraft which can fly high, has observers with a lot of radios aboard, and has a powerful radar on it, what does that also describe? An airborne early warning aircraft, or AWACS as Seneca has put in it. And this is the very interesting scenario. You could get a form of airborne early warning, or AWACS, coming into naval service by the 1950s, simply by accident and exercise. And also sounds like it'd be useful ASW aircraft. Yes, it would be a very useful ASW aircraft. So this is the reality of what you're dealing with. Some of these wackier aircraft are going to... And every nation has their own wacky aircraft. Every nation has their own wacky aircraft. And that's going to have an impact on what's built. That's going to have an impact on people's perception of things. That's going to have an impact on the development going on. It's going to have an impact. So this is what happens sometimes. So on top of that, you're going to get naval exercises, right? The British and the Americans are already doing massive exercises. The British like to turn up in the Mediterranean with the entirety of the home fleet and the Mediterranean fleet, divide the Mediterranean into two, tell everyone else in the Meds to bog off for a couple of days, and then go at it like they're fighting World War III, let alone World War II. Well, imagine that with more equipment. Imagine what's going to come out of those exercises with more equipment. I've told you before in previous videos about exercises that the basic British exercising is, we will tell you that the enemy is here and the other enemy is there. Whichever side wins gets a 72-hour furlough and all the alcohol they can drink. Whichever side loses has to prick up the bar tab and fight. That is pretty much the British method of organising a multi-fleet exercise. It works. There is a reason why the Royal Navy exercises are famed amongst the historians who research them for being the closest to the war fighting they actually find themselves fighting. The actual battles, etc., are the closest to the scenarios that actually happen. Why? Because literally they don't script them, they just let them go and kill each other. That's their entire modus operandi. So the thing is, as these navies grow, as they have more equipment, as they do bigger and bigger exercises as they're growing in size, it's going to impact the development of things. The really interesting thing is, what happens when you start seeing the Dutch already in 1939 us building the radar-guided gunneries, right? Radar-guided 40mm Bofors, the Hayes-Meyer system, etc. The British are going to be following that. The British are going to be looking at it, so the French, so are going to have us. That is what they're going to do. And that is what's going to happen. Knight, I know you want a whole discussion of Roosevelt's health. That's not today's topic of the video, and we've got enough to go through without discussing that. If you're going to keep putting comments in the chat about it, and keep trying to derail the thing, as sometimes you are inclined to do, off to what you're interested in rather than the topic of the video, and as much as I appreciate your normal involvement, I will put you in timeout today. Okay? Because we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I know from the messages I received, a lot of people want to talk about the ships and go through them. And talk about those things. You want to talk about Roosevelt's health? That is not the topic of today's video. Okay? So, And this is the point. When you have big, massive exercises, things can come out of those exercises. Now, though some of those ideas can be right, some of them can be wrong. Remember the false positives of the ASW exercises, which were starting to be corrected, where the Royal Navy had thought that ASDIC had managed to solve everything. But it's only the exercises leading towards the end of the war, really close to the war, they start to realise it hasn't, and there are problems. Now, there's all sorts of other false positives which come from exercises which are being corrected, some which are being corrected, some which aren't. The big false positive that affected a whole lot of design, again, I'm using the British exercise as an example because those are the ones I've spent months going over in first hand, going through reports. But the big one I tend to give to people is, well, in the exercises, when they're studying them, for some reason, the aircraft go for the battleships, battle cruisers, the carriers, and then the cruisers. They're going for the really big assets. And then in wartime, of course, they go for the destroyers. Well, the difference is, and this was something which the British had actually, the Admiralty had started to be tuned into about 1930, well, Henderson had been arguing about it from 1933. People started taking notice of him really wider spread in the Admiralty from 36 onwards, and then carried on taking a notice as things go on. And it started to change things from 36 onwards, but that was too late for some of the decisions that were all being made. The thing is, in exercises, you go after what's bragging rights, because you're not going to die, are you? In wartime, you go after the nearest target you can get your grubby mitts on and then bog out. And yes, if we look at the Japanese versus the Americans, they do aim for the carriers, they do aim for the major striking units, but they also aim for other things. But they do aim, when they're doing a full carrier strike, for a carrier group, for the carrier, for those things. And that's a lot of training. It's the same the Americans do it. But then you look at land-based aircraft and what they tend to go for. They tend to go for the nearest thing that's available. There's a difference in the training. There's a difference in the understanding. There's a difference in, this is a ship, it's a ship, it matters. It's okay. Just sinking a ship is what matters. Okay? So, with that being said, we get to cruisers. Now, here is the other reason why I think you could end up with light fleet carriers being built. So that cruisers can get rid of the aviation. I could see this impacting quite a lot of navies. The idea of getting aviation assets off cruisers to save space, to get rid of a very, very problematic system in terms of it's useful, but to recover the aircraft, you have to stop the ship or bring it virtually to a stop to recover the aircraft, and no one wants to do that in wartime. So all these things, a light fleet one would be kind of interesting. A light fleet one would be very interesting. And Kevin Ray, I'm going to shut that down now. A future video on what the minor navies would do, like if World War II didn't happen, it would be very interesting, but it would also be completely conjecture. This one is based in what their building plans were and what they're likely to do in terms of responding to each other as a bit of a thing. The minor powers, they might decide to compete, they might not. Especially the Dutch, they probably debate for the next 10 years what they're going to do. So, realistically, there is nothing for me to base it in. It would entirely be a fanfic on my part, that's all. So, I'm going to just shut it down as a lovely idea, but not something which I can really do. There isn't enough information out there about the minor navies. Also, the minor navies you're going to talk about are the Polish, the Swedish, Dutch, the Greeks, the Turks. You know, most of the Commonwealth navies are included in the Royal Navy in terms of their construction. Yeah, it's just, it would be a nice to do, but it would entirely be a fanfic. Now, the thing is, the highest you can really get an autoloading tech up to at this point, and you're probably going to be looking at it, because remember, the British are looking at 14-inch autoloaders. but others are going to be looking at, is probably the 9.2-inch gun. Now, why am I saying that? Actually, I'm not talking out of my behind on this one, okay? I have a lot of my dads, I've shown in the past, Institute of Naval Architects papers, and Transactions of Naval Architects. They're called the Transactions of the Institution of Naval Architecture papers. And there's a paper in there which me and Drac found incredibly interesting a few years ago. And that paper was on the automation of gunfire, and it comes from 1920. And the automation of guns. And it's starting to look at the levels at which they could do, and it's already declaring that with the mechanisms that they are already testing, 9.2-inch guns were practicable. So saying 9.2 inches is the limit is probably not going too far wrong. Probably not going too far wrong. Now the thing is, I could see the Americans going in for an 8-inch autoloader, the British trying to do a 9.2-inch autoloader, and probably succeeding, and the Americans also ending up the Alaska class with 12-inch guns. And this is the other problem you have for battle cruisers. That is the sort of scenario you're going to be seeing, is that, you know, these cruisers are getting heavier and more powerful and more capable. So, would that happen? Would that happen? And I think that's going to end up being the sort of problem you're going to have going on. You're going to have an issue with heavy guns. Your options are going to go, we go for a 12-inch gun, which now is well clear of battleships and capital ships because they're up at 16 inches or plus, or you're going for an auto 9.2 or 8-inch gun to provide your rate of fire and your volume of fire. Now, my tendency, if I was designing cruisers, would be to go for the automatic 9.2. It has enough hitting power to deal with most cruiser levels. It's got enough capability, and I can carry enough shells, and I can probably keep keep the rate of fire going. But the 12-inch gun is going to be a very big allure. There is going to be a massive allure to the 12-inch gun. And that's going to be the argument between the big cruisers. Then you get lighter cruisers, which are going to be armed with 6-inch autos. Okay? They're going to go from triple turrets to 6-inch autos almost seamlessly. It's going to happen. Now, the thing is, the 6-inch light cruisers are going to stay in because they're going to be part of providing enough volume of cruisers, but they're still going to be pretty big cruisers, because the cruisers I can see really disappearing are going to be the small cruisers. And we'll talk about this more when we get to destroyers, but I think because of the capability of large destroyers and their likely growth, I think small cruisers like the Arafusas, like the Capitani Romani, will probably end up dropping down into a destroyer leader role of about 2.5 to 3,000 tons. And that's the reality of it, because the heavy cruisers are going to have an expanding role. The 6-inch cruisers are going to be providing numbers of cruisers. But the smaller cruisers, it's going to be a case of, do we build this to cruiser standard or destroyer standard? Well, destroyer is going to be cheaper. So you're going to build the destroyers. So I think the baby cruisers, the scout cruiser sort of thing, disappears. Now the next thing on top of that is missiles. Someone's already talked about the liquid oxygen petrol guided anti-aircraft projectile, aka the LOPGAP system, which was one of the British surface-to-air missile sort of projects. And I can also already tell you that I'm fairly certain the rocket systems that are already in, etc., there is going to be stuff produced. Okay? And this is going to be another capability which is going to come in. Especially as radars come in. You're going to have radar-guided gunnery to start off with. Then you're going to have radar-guided rocket firing systems which are going to have the mount targeting the system and the rocket radar launched, and possibly, this is going to sound strange, you possibly have something like when the rocket finally gets a certain level of return from the radar beam, it goes boom, it rides the radar beam up. There are interesting ideas and options for how this stuff develops. Again, you have to remember there's not going to be the tech sharing there historically was in World War II. So each nation's going to go down its own little route a bit more, which could be interesting. It could make it very, very interesting. And that's going to be the point you have to start thinking through. When you're talking about this as a scenario, when you're talking about this as a reality, there are going to be development cycles. Wars are often put forward by people as being these periods of massive technological advancement. They aren't. What usually happens in wars is you don't develop anything new per se. What you do is take the stuff which you've already worked out, the theory and the laboratory conditions working version of, and turn it into reality. The money massively shifts from research and development to development. Okay? Research is going off into the wide blue yonder and coming up with new things. Development is turning what you've found into something practical. So in wartime, the R&D budget shifts to the D section massively. Massively shifts to the D section. So that's what happens to Britain and France, etc. in 1939. That's when they shift massively. The Americans shift massively in about 1941. But in this scenario, you don't have them shifting massively from research to development at any point in the 40s. So they're going to keep developing. And they're going to keep improving, and they're going to keep exercising, and they're going to keep looking and comparing at each other. And remember, their economies are much better positions because they aren't getting bombed. So a lot more of the infrastructure is going to be capable, and it's going to be improved. It's going to be a lot more people around to utilize. You're not going to have 70% of your young men and women off doing war service in the various parts of the armed forces. You're not. You're going to have them there, going into industry, going into education, going into science and engineering and learning and developing stuff. And they're back sheds in terms of Britain. That's going to have an impact. That's going to have an impact. It's going to be a very big impact in terms of how things happen. And I think cruisers are probably going to be affected by this the most. And as you've, in the nicest way, I am trying to see what you're, look. I'm going to call you IO because for some reason you've got IOHH2FZ and I can't figure out how to pronounce that. So IO, you're quite right. You know, AA gun projectiles like the historically SAN N8 Zeus, which could enter service as a way to provide gun crews with better air defense. Potentially they lose some of their 5-inch batteries or their secondary batteries to missile launching systems. The British had plans for basically the ability to insert missile launchers into barbettes of secondaries. So that's probably going to be what they're looking at. Michael Cooch, no. Britain won't. Nicest way, the Royal Navy will never switch to D until war starts. They'll never switch from R&D to R and capital D, as you put it, in 40-41 because they expect war in 42. They weren't told to expect war in 42. That's misunderstanding what I've said repeatedly. Basically, when you have the 10-year rule end in 1932, it means you expect war after 1942. So, for example, if the Royal Navy therefore then went, well, we're switching to development in 1941 because we expect war in 1942, and then war doesn't happen till 1949, they're going to be massively behind the curve. So you don't do it till you're actually in a major war. And you don't even do it in a minor war. Can you imagine during the Falklands War and other minor conflicts, the British switched from research and development to just focusing on development? No. They carried on with R&D as normal. So that's the thing. In this scenario, there's no major war, so there's going to be no switching from R&D to focusing on D in this period. Because that's, the scenario you're dealing with. A war is expected after 1942, yes. But, when after 1942? Who knows? Who knows? And the Mark 13 Tada was intended to be small enough to cleanly drop into a 5-inch 38 mount. Exactly. Exactly. That's pretty much where it's going to be going. And that's probably what they'll be aiming for. Thank you, Dave Ruggan. Thank you for the 5 memberships. Are cruisers still classified as either heavy or light, or do other classifications appear? I have no idea for that one. I think you probably still keep to heavy and light, depending on whether they have 6-inch or bigger guns. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting thing to see happens. And Joe Fredericks, I wonder if different nation states would even bother radio-guided munitions. Missiles might not even be invented until far later on. Some will, some won't. Again, it's kind of like the aircraft carriers in the battleship scenario. In peacetime, major nations like the British Empire, America, etc. are probably going to develop them as well as the guns, from the point of view of it might not be the weapon system yet, but it's the coming weapon system, and we know it is. So you have to, you start developing it, you start spending the money on it, because again, it's not like today where they act like, well, war might never happen, so do we need to develop this? It's more a case of war is going to happen, whether we like it or not, so let's prepare for it. And as I said with the battleships earlier, the battleship is the weapon of today. The carrier is the weapon of maybe tomorrow, maybe a week on Tuesday. You don't know when, but it's the coming weapon. So you build both. You just don't know when it's going to be. Well, this was also the other point I was making about the battle cruiser earlier. The battle cruiser phrasing could drop down. So whilst I actually believe Alaska's are where heavy cruisers are one of the areas where heavy cruisers would naturally have ended up if there hadn't been the treaty limitations, there is the fact that in what they might actually do in time is they might actually start calling large cruisers like that battle cruisers. They might skip down from being a designation of capital ship to being a designation of cruiser. And as Matthew Keeling has pointed out, there have been attempts at radio-guided munitions for nearly 50 years by the time we're talking about. Yeah, it's one of the beautiful things of radar, as I talked about before, owes its beginnings and theories to about the 1890s. It's a great... You don't need to get up, Duff. Okay, nice. Just going to get some Irish brew. It's one of those great points. It was coming for a lot longer than it was there. And yeah, I will be on Discord later. I will be on Discord. And that being said, though, shameless book plug time. So thank you everyone for liking, sharing, subscribing, and supporting the channel. Thank you for all the memberships. Thank you for making it all possible. You'll note there's a lot of things coming up. There's a link below to the talk at King's, which should be online as well as in person. I would love as many people there as in person as possible. I really do like to have a lot of people there, and it'll be a lot of fun. The more people there are, the more fun it's going to be. I should do some broadcasting of it on Twitter, shouldn't I? And start talking to people about it on Twitter, inviting them. I'm not sure I've done anything. I will do so. I've left it very, very late. I've been concentrating more on YouTube and talking to all of you, but I should do some stuff on Twitter as well. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Also, after Historiathon, various things will happen. Books will come out. Things will be announced and published. Hopefully. Okay, we're at the halfway point, but if you tell your mother I caved in and gave you something, you are never getting anything from me ever again. You got that? You're all keeping quiet as well. You've been very good. Cool. And you know, we're all able to do all this because of your support. All the shipshape crew are able to do everything we do because of your support. Fleet's able to run ramblings even when he's, you know, so short because of your support. You know, Drac is able to be going off around the world, wandering and looking at things and playing around with steam plants because of your support. I'm able to do this channel because of your support. So is Garrus the Brit because of your support. So thank you. Thank you all of you for doing everything you do. And thank you for being so kind. Take Peter Dawson and Peter Dawson. Petra Dawson? Pete Dawson, yeah. Anyway, someone on Twitch, clip this. No. I know my Twitchers. They're all good people. My Twitchers are great people. There's not enough chatting going on Twitch, but they'll come. They'll come. So, back to the discussion. And yeah, the other thing you have to consider about radar-guided ammunitions and various missiles, etc., is that nations like Japan, etc., even Italy and Germany and those sort of and Soviet Union might consider missiles a way to be an offset strategy against the major powers. Because you'll know how it's going to happen. You know, it's like today, they're going to come and go, these missiles are so fast and powerful, you'll never be able to stop them. They're the unstoppable weapon system. It's not just going to be about air defensive missiles, it's going to be anti-ship missiles. You are probably going to get something like the Halland class, i.e. the Swedish destroyers like the Småland. And the Småland is, I really love the Småland because it shows me exactly what this kind of period of destroyer would look like in sort of the early 1950s. It's got a torpedo launcher, and man on top of it is a missile launcher. And I could see that happening so much because that's going to be a great way to make your destroyers powerful. They fire off the missiles at the enemy, and then after them, they've got the torpedoes still. The missiles may sink the enemy. The torpedoes definitely will. The missiles can hit at longer range, and then you come into your enemy who's already on fire and in trouble, and you stick a torpedo in them. Just imagine the torpedo commanders in this period, the destroyer commanders in this period. They'd just be... yeah. It would be a massive amount of work going on. A massive amount of work and effort being put into it. Now, by 50s, Joel, you could be right. By the 50s, the battleships numbers could be being reduced in favour of the aircraft carriers. They might not be. You see, there's two scenarios where I could see that happening. A, development of missiles and the idea that the armour can provide you with some level of protection. And B, the fact that which ships are going to be carrying the most surface-to-air missiles, which ships are going to be carrying the strongest air defences to help defend a task group for a carrier. you could see the battleship turned from the primary offensive weapon of the battle group to the primary defensive weapon of the battle group. And that could happen. So whereas you might think, well, battleship, that's position it's taken as capital ship is over. Well, no, hang on. If you consider the British had already been theorising battle groups based around a carrier and a fast battleship or fast capital ship working together as a battle group, and had done a couple of exercises where they'd used 2 carriers and 2 fast battleships. Well, when I say fast battleships, they had renown, I think, simulating that it was 2 fast battleships, from memory, and they had a carrier presenting those 2 carriers, sort of thing. That's quite a strong possibility that you end up with that as the scenario, where you see a sort of transition period where the battleships might not reduce in number. They're probably built up to their 24 plus strength already well before 1950, and they might start reducing after that. They might not start being replaced one for one. But the thing is, the battleships could find a new niche, especially if they haven't had a war where they've been destroyed as much as they have, where you haven't had a massive pause in construction, where there's a lot of them being without replaced, and you build a whole load of new ones. And the thing is, you're also getting a lot of time to test out the weapon systems for your various ships. Now, with destroyers, as said, I expect the light cruisers to disappear. I expect the large destroyers to split into rather 3 sort of sections. You'll end up with an escort destroyer sort of level, which won't have a torpedo armament, but will be designed to provide the extra numbers to round out battle groups, and to provide primarily ASW support and air defense. A defensive destroyer, so to speak. You'll have your bulk of destroyers. They'll be fleet destroyers, general purpose, all-round attack ships. They might well be armed with missiles as well as torpedoes by 1950s, or some form of rocket-powered system anyway. And they'll have decent guns of the 5-inch or 4.5-inch to 5-inch category, probably in most nations. In some nations they'll be bigger. In some nations they will have the 5.25 or even larger gun category, but we'll leave that to one side. That's probably going to be less likely a scenario than it's going to be something which is going to be hopefully quickly disabused of. But there again, some nations without wartime experience are going to get rather attached to the idea of them actually being smarter than everyone else and actually having something. Because the thing is, when you have radar-guided gunnery, you feel you can engage at longer ranges. And that's true. But until you have fully stabilized all your guns, and that's going to be an interesting thing, working out the stabilization process. Historically, the stabilization systems which were developed for guns actually start off with the Dutch, are developed quite significantly by the British, and passed over to the Americans, and basically all the Allies add in bits of information and develop a gun stabilization, and then it gets passed out and disseminated, and everyone ends up developing their own systems based on that. I wouldn't be surprised if you see more stabilization going in, because it's already realized that the big problem for destroyer guns, and the big problems for light guns in general, whether they're on capital ships or the cruisers or destroyers, is that a lot of their accuracy depends on the stability of the mount and how stable the mount is when firing. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting. And as well as that, I think you have the larger destroyers. You have the larger destroyers that are going to be filling in some of the cruiser roles, are going to be filling in the picket duty roles and the scout line duty roles, and are going to be stepping up to fill in roles. I think things like the Capitani Romani class are going to be destroyers. They're going to be destroyers. And they fit as destroyers. I think you're going to see things like the Trouble class, the L-70s, those sort of things becoming more and more common. Large fleet destroyers filling the role of light cruiser, but of the small light cruisers, but on a lot cheaper to build, especially with the amount of money you're spending on other stuff. Now, one thing people have reminded me in the chat is that I didn't talk about aircraft weaponry, and I wanted to do that after I'd covered destroyers. And there's a reason I've been talking about rocket-based air defense, and there's a reason I waited till now to talk about it. So, one of the interesting things I think you're going to find in exercises, and I think you're going to have this turning up in exercises, is that the layered air defenses are going to be considered more effective against dive bombers than it actually is at that point. Now, the thing is, that's actually not going to be too wrong for a couple of reasons. But it's going to be wrong, and it's going to be right enough that it's going to lead to people thinking about other systems to use. I.e., if you can't get in a position to dive bomb a target, how else can you hit it? Well, it's a torpedo, but again, a torpedo, when there's rocket-based air defense riding straight down a radar beam towards the torpedo, launching aircraft, that doesn't seem sensible. So you're probably going to see a lot of development of anti-ship weaponry for aircraft. And you're probably going to see rocket-based weaponry at least come in a lot more sooner, in terms of, than, you might imagine. You're also probably going to see some work going into rocket-powered torpedoes. Let me explain this one. It's a rather easy jump to go from, oh yeah, let's have a torpedo which drops from the air as we're flying fast, to let's have a torpedo system which launches from the aircraft, goes a few miles, and then drops into the water. And they're already sort of looking into that idea by the end of World War II. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see them push forward in this period. And push forward quite hard. Now, smiling flip-flops. You've asked the question of how many destroyers would the navies have. Well, the specifics... in specific numbers, yeah, I can't really tell you it's going to be 212 or something like that. But you're talking hundreds of ships overall for the major navies. That's broadly speaking what they need. And broadly speaking what they already have. The British is it going to be enough? Probably not. But is it going to be enough to do the jobs is it going to be enough to do all the jobs they want to do? No. Is it going to be enough to do the jobs they have to do? Probably. But you have to remember, the Americans have to recapitalize the Clemsons, the four-stackers, and replace them, so that's where you're going to get a lot of things, probably like the Sumter class. And you get the British having to replace the V&Ws, which is where the Hunt class are going to come in. And remember, a lot of these ships were already being ordered in 1939. The British were already ordering Flower-class corvettes to replace the Flower-class sloops in 1939. They're already ordering the Hunt-class escort destroyers in that period, etc. So, yeah, a lot of these ships are already coming into service quite early in this period. So, yeah, you're going to have a lot of development going on. And you're probably going to have mixed air groups, okay? You're going to have, even if jets, aircrafts do come into service, you're going to have mixed air groups. You're not going to have an all-jet air group very quickly. It's going to take time. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it's not jet fighters you see first, but jet attack aircraft. Okay? I think that's what you probably see first, jet attack aircraft rather than jet fighters. Because then they can dash in, dash out, and avoid enemy air defenses, and that's going to be the idea. But if you go back to destroyers, the big thing is, I think the nation which is probably going to do least well this hell of peace period, in terms of destroyer numbers, is probably going to be the US. Because people often forget that there are multiple two-ocean Navy acts. I shouldn't stop being so kind to you. Multiple two-ocean Naval acts, and the vast majority of them don't include a lot of destroyers. In fact, it's the last one that gets the lots of destroyers, not the previous ones. Which is why the US Navy is so short of destroyers when war breaks out. Because basically, the Senate believes their lesson and experience from the four stackers Clemsons is that they can order destroyers and they appear. They honestly do think that they don't need to order them in advance. So they think they can spend their money and limit their money and spending and just be building larger units. So they're probably the people who are getting the least investment going in a destroyer force for their size is probably going to be the Americans. Because of their politics. Again, though, we'll deal with lots of other navies like that. You know, the Soviet Union is probably going to be in a similar situation. Because Stalin is obsessed with getting big ships into service. He probably will get big ships into service. He probably will get carriers, and he probably will get battleships and battle cruisers into service because everyone else is building them, and he's got no war to distract him. It's going to be an interesting scenario, realistically. Joe Fredericks, we're not talking about rapid changes of technology and tactics and equipment. It really isn't. It might seem rapid, but it's not rapid. It's continuations of existing trends. That's the thing is, people often think it's rapid because it in World War II, but it's a most of what happens in World War II is a continuation of a trend which was already happening in the 30s. And this is, 1918 to 1930. To 1939 is probably one of the least discussed covered areas when it comes to the technological development and tactical development of navies. The amount of times I get told this is something which appears in World War II, and I go, nope, 1936, 1935, 1934, 1937, not World War II. It's just you start hearing about it on a mass scale in World War II. It's like the deployment of radar on warships. The British are ramping up their plans to deploy. Have already got it deployed on about a dozen ships in 1939. By the beginning of 1939, and are ramping up for deploying on more. So there's going to be a lot of radars already deployed. There's going to be a lot of technology already coming through. As for the jet aircraft, again, this is the thing of with the stuff coming in. You already have these things. The British already have a rocket anti-aircraft system, the rocket projection system, which is terrible. It's laying mines in the sky, but they're working on improving that. So a lot of these systems we're talking about are already things which are in place and in the process of being developed. Now, I don't think you necessarily get anti-ship missiles like you're imagining like some people are putting in the chat, in sort of the time period we're talking about. Those might be radar-guided rockets, very large rockets, some of them, but it's going to take time. It's not going to be missiles, because the big thing we're talking about is a development in seeker heads, etc., and shrinking of them. And I think that's probably going to be coming along, but that's not going to be coming that quickly. But again, a radar anti-aircraft missiles, anti-aircraft weapons. I'm using missiles to describe them, but they're probably going to be radar-guided rocket systems, etc. Let's be honest, the difference between a radar-guided rocket system and a missile is not that great in terms of the early rocket systems. So yeah, they're going to be coming along. I once heard it said the Germans tried to build the super weapons of the 50s and 60s, while the Allies just built the super weapons of 39 to 47. No. Not really. I know some people who have made that same analysis, and I've sometimes sat there and looked at them and gone, no, the Germans have tried to make the super weapons as they managed to make the cartoon super weapons that they could imagine, and the Allies tended to do similar super weapons. But the thing is, the Allies had the infrastructure industry to be able to build up theirs. That's the advantage. MC Legend 13, we've already done the section on battleships. That was done a while back at the beginning. It's the transistors, it's developing transistors, which is the big thing for getting practical missiles as we would understand them, rather than radar-guided rockets. But if I use a missile, please don't be upset with me. But it's just easier. Radar-guided rocket or missile. In this period, that's sort of an interchangeable phrasing. That's what we're discussing. The missiles, as we understand them, transistors, and eventually lots of other interesting ideas later in computing power will come along to make them what we understand them to be. And as I think I discussed already with the radar mounts earlier, the first mounts would be radar-guided mounts, which would point the rockets in the right direction like radar-guided guns, and then just fire rockets in that direction. Maybe with another radar beam crossing them, so that at a certain point when they detect both beams or they get some level of return, they go boom. And if you're thinking, well, Alex, how can they? What are you talking about on that one? Well, that's literally the radio beams crossing each other is literally the system the British were using during wartime to guide bombers in and make them drop over the right target. They were trying to long-range radio beams to try and pinpoint the targets, etc. So again, it's nothing which they're not already thinking about and they're not already working on the ideas of. Again, Joel, and I don't want to keep labouring this point, I don't think I said missile. I think I said rocket and rocket-assisted torpedo. I didn't say missile. So you might have heard that as missile, but I didn't say that. I said rocket-assisted torpedo. And that is something which, again, you might not be on the jet aircraft. That might be on the propeller aircraft, or the larger propeller aircraft, and they're carrying, because you might end up with things like akin to the Fairey Gannet. But, you know, again, you might get rocket-guided, rocket-assisted radio-guided glide bombs. Again, there's nothing unusual. You have those in service or on development by all sides by the end of 1945 in World War II. And again, they're on the papers. They're being looked at a lot earlier than that. There's quite a few designs wandering around in the 1930s of those ideas. So again, it's nothing which is impossible. Exactly, 96 stuff like the HS-293, and yeah. And so there's a lot of these ideas are already going through and already being developed. They're not the way we would deal them today, but they're the ways they could approach them at the time, and they might be suitable for them. And yeah, this is also the other thing I think with the relatively viability of missile systems, especially early air defense systems, which are sort of tube valve systems, is going to be another reason why gun-based AA is not going to disappear. It's going to be complementary. It's going to be adding a layer to the air defense onion. It's not going to be replacing guns completely. It's just not going to be. This then leads us to submarines. And this is going to be the most contentious area probably I'm going to be talking about, because, yeah, well, the Germans aren't going to get to take over the Dutch technology grounds. There's going to be a lot more spending from a lot of other powers on submarine development, and as you can see from the U-class in the Royal Navy and various classes which are going on in both the Japanese and the US navies, there's a lot of interesting ideas out there. I think you're going to see more and more concentration on the range of submarines and the operating circumstances necessary to speed. And this is going to be the fun thing. For submarines, I don't think Germany is going to be in a position they're going to be producing a lot of submarines. It's going to be like they were prior to World War II, when they were barely getting enough submarines for training being built because of the restrictions placed on funding. And while they're trying to build a balanced fleet with all the limitations going on, that's going to continue to be the trouble. Because again, they've got to get funding from the same pool. And if war's delayed, their economy's going to be in issues anyway. So, yeah, I don't see Germany pushing on for the Type 21 early or anything like that. But I think they're going to be developing stuff. I think everyone's going to be working on stuff. It should feed us into the torpedo development. I'm fairly certain, with enough time, enough testing, someone's going to twig that the Mark 14, Mark 13 torpedoes are issuey. They might resolve it before they get into conflict, or they might, how do I put this, announce a new torpedo. There are all sorts of ways for them to fix it, but there's going to be no scenario whereby they don't eventually find that out. I'd say that's for everyone. They've got time to actually put into investment and research and development on their torpedoes and actually go do some studying. But this is going to affect the submarines. Also, the growing number of escorts is going to affect the submarines. Because if you've got nations recapitalizing their second-line escorts, so, for example, Hunt's replacing V&W class, Flower class replacing Flower class corvettes replacing Flower class sloops, other things we're going to be talking about when we get to the escorts. That's going to mean you're going to look at it and go, well, hang on, the escorts have already been built up to a large number. Do our submarines really have a chance? And if we're concentrating on building super-duper battleships for our egos of our dictators, that's going to have a real problem for us developing other sensible systems. Now, this is the interesting scenario. It's going to be, how do I put this politely? It's going to be interesting to see how the larger submarines especially go. Naga's already asked this about the Japanese carrier submarines. I don't think the Japanese are going to necessarily push forward with the carrier submarines, but I think you could see things like the I-400s being developed and built out in numbers, and that's going to lead to an impact. I think I treat carrier submarines, i.e. submarines with large air groups aboard them, kind of like an early attempt at an SSGN. And I do treat the aircraft mentally as disposable, because they are. Let's be honest, it's kind of like float planes from cruisers, but even worse, in that you have to stop. You not only have to stop the boat to pick up the aircraft, you have to surface it and reveal it on the surface, where it's at the most difficult position. There are going to be other things they can do. Commando insertion might be one of them, but it's also going to depend on how things evolve, how things develop. As said, my suspicion is that if you don't have a major world war, you're going to have lots of little wars going on. Lots of little wars. And I think that's going to see some interesting conclusions drawn. I think submarine operational time at sea, i.e. their length of patrol and their range, are going to be seen as the biggest factors. Why? Because of the lessons which were drawn from by the Italians and others from the Spanish Civil War, believe it or not, where various powers had submarines watching what was going on. And various powers are watching with submarines and trying to pay attention and trying to learn what was going on. And the lessons which came out of that were mostly length of time on patrol. How long could you stay hidden and where could you go for? And that's going to be the interesting thing. If that becomes the driver for submarine operations, their length of patrol and their range, then they're going to get bigger. Now, whether navies end up going down the route of the Royal Navy of having a three-tier submarine force, small, medium, and large, or whether navies we're going to have large only, and maybe large and small, it's going to be an interesting thing. It's going to depend on each navy. For the Royal Navy, the reason they go large, medium, and small is because of different geostrategic circumstances they have for operating: North Sea, North Atlantic, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Pacific. And the differences you need for operating submarines in all of them, and the different requirements. Realistically, let's be honest. If you're in the Mediterranean, you should be operating U-class and later on V-class boats, and if you're not, why not? Because that's about the size which can actually operate successfully in the Mediterranean. There's a reason why they make up the vast majority of the Allied submarine kills, as in the ones who get the kills in that period. Now, AIP diesels, again, with the growth of aircraft and aircraft numbers and exercise experience, I could see far more powers going for maybe not air-independent propulsion, but snorkels and some sort of animal snorkel system. I could see that becoming a big thing. I could see that being a factor. And that realistically could be an interesting scenario. Now, some have already brought up nuclear reactors, and look, the thing is, I can see nuclear reactors coming into existence in the 1950s, but to get them aboard ships and aboard submarines is going to be a long-term project. It's not going to be something people are going to jump into. If you consider even post-World War II, with the effect of the Cold War, it was a long time coming, and all the information technology which had been developed by joint work in the World War II, which had pushed forward the understanding of nuclear power, of nuclear capability, and nuclear reactors. If you don't have that sharing of information, don't have that cross-pollination of ideas, I'd say you put that back about, as I've said, I reckon you don't get a bomb till into the 1950s. And I don't think you get reactors that you can scale to appropriate sizes and operate with appropriate chemistry for ships until the 1950s. And I would say the ships you first get with a nuclear power are going to be aircraft carriers. And there is a reason for this. The reason is if your warship is if your carrier is powered by a nuclear reactor, it doesn't need to carry fuel for itself. Well, it probably does carry fuel for diesel generators, but not much. It can concentrate most of its hull space carrying fuel for its air group, which makes its air group more effective. Also, therefore, that helps with range. The other group of ships which could get it will be cruisers, especially the very large cruisers. I could see them getting nuclear power. But it's going to be interesting to see how it evolves. Snorkel. Snorkel? Snorkel? That's how my friend who rents them out down in Coverack Bay pronounces it, and I just go with it. Schnorkel. Matthew Cummings. The trouble is, who's going to be going for nuclear power, and who's building an icebreaker? Who's going to be getting it first? I don't think the Soviets are going to get it first. I don't think the Finns are going to get it first. And I don't think Britain or America is building that many icebreakers that are going to be putting nuclear power in them. So I think the first warships which are going to get it are going to be aircraft carriers. I don't think the Soviets are going to jump in and get that far along that quickly. And Joel, whilst you don't have war going on, you do have a period of increased tension and competition going on between major powers. So think of it kind of like a Cold War, a multipolar Cold War scenario. You're going to have a chunk of money. Maybe not the same amount of money you get in actual open wartime, but a fairly hefty amount. So, that's life it is. Don't know many proxy wars happening, but and there are things like I said. I think the Winter War probably still happens. I think the Soviets still try and invade Finland, etc. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Germans get involved in there, as I discussed at the beginning, and various other scenarios like that happening. So not so much proxy wars as little wars between powers which don't involve the whole world getting involved. But it'll be interesting. So then we have escorts. Now, realistically, here's the dirty little secret about escorts. The only nation which is realistically going to be building these in huge numbers, the only alliance which is going to be doing that is going to be the British Empire in the 1940s. They're the only ones who are doing it, and they're doing it for two reasons. One, to build up Dominion naval capacity, and two, to protect the sea lines of communication. Now, the reason for this, and the reason I say this, is because when we consider what they're going for, what they're trying to operate in, things like the Bathurst class are a great way of improving Australian confidence and improving Australian success. And they're already building them in 1939. They're already ordered the Flower class, they've already ordered the Hunt class long before war begins. So they're building them, and they're building them up. And also, we're talking about a nation which is deathly afraid of submarines and mine warfare. Remember, it was the mines of the U-boat forces in World War I which came closest to defeating Britain. The odds are it's never going to go away out of their analysis and out of their thinking, and they're going to be pushing for it. And Thomas, do you foresee that India becomes a dominion in that time frame? It was in the time frame to become dominion. There were quite a lot of powers which were down to become dominions in that time frame. Quite a lot of members of the British Empire were on the dominization track. Remember, as I've tried to say before, Britain just doesn't magically just turn its empire into a commonwealth. Some people do treat us go, yeah, Britain just did it. Not sure how, they just did it. No, that was a long-term plan. The British have been planning for turning the empire into a commonwealth for about 50 years, 50, 60 years by the time it actually happens. They've been laying groundwork for it for a long, long time, a freakishly long time. The British are probably the only empire in history which prepared for their demise and were working out a way to transition away from the empire to something else. Now, with a lot of people going back quickly to sloops and people going for air-independent propulsion, there's a reason I talked about the snorkel and not AIP. The thing is, until you get to World War II and the experiences of air power versus submarines, etc., people are still talking about, navies are still concerned about the surface speed of submarines, as that adds to their maximum range and their length of time on patrol, because they can go faster on the surface than they can underwater. So I think whilst I can see snorkels happening, snorkels, you understand what I'm saying, it's just, I said, the way my friend pronounced it, and I've been hanging around him far too much lately, I guess. He's the same guy who I hire my kayak off and things when I go kayaking around the coast. With all that stuff going on, there are reasons for developing those, but going full AIP, it may happen, but it's going to be a lot slower. It's going to be a lot further towards the end of this scenario. That you're going to get no-go zones area for certain coastal areas, Joel Roderick. And in the nicest way, this is something that comes up quite regularly with various coastal offences. They go, this weapon system's create a no-go zone. The reality is, what it's meant is, if you're going to enter this zone, you have to enter the level of force. Okay, there are missile batteries. Okay, so we have to bring carriers along so we can suppress those missile batteries before we enter them. That's what happens. It's a case of, with coastal offences, as I've done a whole video about this, you cannot ever create a scenario where no fleet can go here. You just made that, well, for a fleet to go here, it has to bring this level of force. It's one of the things you have to get away from. It comes up a lot in the media, it's a lot in marketing, a lot of the idea, and sometimes some historians put it in books as well. The idea that you can create an area which is invincible and impregnable. No, you raise the bar of force required for entry. So you might make it impractical, or it might be a case like the Pas de Calais. Do we want to attack there where the enemy are at their strongest and will require this much force? Or do we want to attack Normandy where they're like this and we can go in with this and we therefore risk less, sacrifice less, and we have more forceful later on and pushing in? That's the scenario you have going on. It's a trade-off you make. So don't think it necessarily as a no-go zone. Think of it as more of a zone of, this requires this level of force to crack. Now, yeah, there's going to be developments in submarines. As I said, I think longer range. There could be some high-speed submarines coming in, but again, a lot of the high-speed submarine fears which come post-World War II come from some of the German technology which were being researched, and fear it would fall into Soviet hands, and that was going to be their response. And the reality, of course, was nuclear-powered submarines actually came out, not HTP, not various those sort of powered submarines. But it's going to be interesting watching the world develop. And you're also going to get things like the Black Swans, and also those being built, and probably a lot of escorts are going to enter service. I will say now, that's going to start to create a problem. And the problem is going to be this: with this many ASDIC services systems in service and in use, this many vessels carrying radar, etc., they're going to start developing, they're going to start using the tech more, and the more you use it, the more quickly you develop it. The more you notice its problems. So this is the reality. There are a lot of technologies which we know are made during World War II, but when they first enter service, they have teething problems, they have issues. They have, oh, this bit didn't work, this didn't work. Well, if you have large exercises, if you've been using them for 10 years, and war breaks out, suddenly you're going to be that much further down the development path and the research and implementation path, and you're going to be that much better prepared. You're going to be that much more used to operating them. So the reality is there's going to be a lot of interesting ideas coming through. A lot of interesting ideas coming through. And it's also worthwhile thinking about the wider development going on. The wider development that's going to be happening. Things like, how do, people looking at systems and going, how do we defend against them? How do we not? And one of the interesting things is you're probably going to deal with the nations which are most quick to develop ASDIC or sonar and be using it, are also going to be most quick to develop the counters to them, because they're going to have them to exercise with and work out what the counters are. And they're going to want to work out what the counters are so they can work out how to counter the counters. So what you're dealing with in this period of this 40s, 50s period is going to be a huge amount of tech races. It's going to be a massive tech race. And realistically, you haven't really got a qualitative race going on. A quantitative race going on. Why am I saying this? Okay, to an extent, there is, for the Americans and the Brits, a little bit of a quantitative race in that maintaining themselves as the number one powers in the world for the British Empire and the USA. There's going to be a little bit of a quantitative race going on between them. But realistically, it's not going to have any heat to it, and it's not going to be... It's going to be more about the qualitative race again. For the other powers involved, think about it. Japan knows they can't industrially match Britain and America, the British Empire and America. They're not trying. France isn't going to be. Italy isn't going to be. And Plan Z, for all its dreams, is certainly not a match for what the British are going to be building in this scenario, let alone the French, the British, the French and the Americans combined, or anything like that. It's just not. The Soviets as well, they're not involved. So there isn't really a quantitative race going on. It's going to be a lot of qualitative races, which is going to spur on a lot of development. A lot of development. And a lot of interesting ideas. And it's like, if we're talking about you've talked about aircraft direction escorts. Well, again, imagine if you're in a scenario where you've got a large number of light fleet carriers built for cruiser carrier duties. You have to remember the escort carriers of World War II, the Woolworth carriers. The design studies which consider them originally, and first ideas which I was working on, are all part of the cruiser carrier doctrine of how to produce cruiser carriers to fill the cruiser carrier roles. And cruiser carrier roles were convoy protection, and cruiser reconnaissance and support, and cruiser station support. So if you're building a whole load of light fleet carriers, that's one of their jobs is going to be with the convoys. So do you need aircraft direction escorts, or do you have a light fleet carrier? Now, one of the things that the aircraft direction escorts, of course, is they come from the coastal convoys, especially the ones going up and down the British East Coast. But in this scenario, you don't have them happening until wartime. That's something you're not going to have till wartime. And again, you're probably going to find some ships are converted to the role. It happens. It's going to be kind of interesting to see what happens. There'll be a lot of systems which will flop and some which will succeed. Henderson has a lot of interesting ideas. I have literally followed along some of Henderson's ideas, but honestly, he dies in 1939, so we're going to have to hope one of his subordinates. And I have put in the recorded video, the likely subordinate who's going to come push things forward is a guy called Caspar John, who was sort of under Henderson's wing. And Caspar John, but for those who don't know, does actually end up as First Sea Lord. He's a pretty darn capable naval officer and a very good fleet air arm officer. And he's also the guy who's in America ordering aircraft for the fleet air arm before they become realistically part of the Air Ministry ordering group. There's a whole debate about that one, because historically people go, oh, the Royal Navy didn't join in this group, so they weren't out ordering in America at the same time. They didn't join it. Actually, there was already a Royal Navy party out in America trying to order it, and then they're subsumed into the group, and it's a whole fun thing. So this is why sometimes they go, well, the Royal Navy doesn't turn up till later to order aircraft from America. Well, actually, no, they got there first, had their own party out there trying to order aircraft because they couldn't get them out of the Ministry of Aircraft, and then once it's decided to combine, that's when they combine the two together. Why is Cube coming up? Are we trying to scare off fleet? Fredericks, it's going to depend on what guns you're talking about. It's going to depend on what guns you're talking about. And honestly, there's probably going to, as again, aircraft speed. One of the reasons why range becomes important is because of aircraft speed, so you have time of engagement. So basically, if an aircraft is coming in at 100 miles an hour, you want to engage it far enough away that you have plenty of time to engage it. So you need to be sort of engaging it at, let's say 30 miles, at a certain distance. Let's say if it's coming at 100 miles an hour, that's moving at a mile and a half a minute. Okay, so if you want to engage it plenty of distance away from your ship, you want to engage it at 5 miles range, because that gives you 3 minutes to engage it before it gets within striking range of the ship. But if it's coming in at 300 miles an hour, well, you want to engage it probably a bit further away than that, don't you? Because it's moving at 5 miles a minute. So if you want to say at the same 3 minutes of engagement time, you want to engage it out at roughly the 18 to 20 mile range. So that's what drives range in terms of guns. And then you have rate of fire, etc. And you have all sorts of things which can come in as well. Runon, you got fleeted by your foreman yesterday. I'm sorry for you. I feel like we are doing with the very kind Foxo, who's the HR rep for Shipshape. You need to, go through the appropriate channels about these things. No one should be fleeted. H1, I don't know what that means. Be happy you don't know what to be fleeted means. Now, auxiliaries. Now, this is going to be an interesting area because you have to remember HMS Unicorn, which I've referenced a couple of times, is a forward aviation support ship, not an aircraft carrier. I don't want any of you looking her up, looking at her picture and going, that's an aircraft carrier, because she's not. She's a forward aviation support ship. Upon the honour of the Admiral who ordered her, 3rd Sea Lord Admiral Henderson, she is a forward aviation support ship, not an aircraft carrier. Stop thinking such naughty things. Under no circumstances would he use the auxiliaries section of the treaties to get an extra aircraft carrier into the fleet, into the Navy. No way. It's a forward aviation support ship meant to support the illustrious class and give them full effect. Never would that happen. Now the thing is, probably ships like that, a lot more of them would be built. There's also going to be other areas of construction. Think about the tankers. Historically, the Royal Navy are building their fast tankers quite happily. Then war happens. Winston Churchill decides war's going to be in Europe only. So he decides that the tankers should be converted to amphibious warfare vessels. And so the Royal Navy's fast tankers that are under construction get converted to carry landing craft around for the war. And have massive gantries on them to carry those landing craft. And then slowly get converted back afterwards. And it's a case of... yeah. It's an interesting time. It's an interesting time. So you probably get those ships built. You probably get a lot more of, the auxiliaries built, especially the infrastructure. You probably get some, more torpedo destroyer depot ships, submarine depot ships, various other depot ships built. You probably get more infrastructure constructed generally. All these things are going to mass up. All these things are going to allow you to do things. And that's realistically the point. The more you're able to do, the more you're able to build, the better position you're going to be in. Now, for the Germans, this could be problematic because, of course, they have their Hilfscruiser scenario. And... their secret merchant ships like the Altmark being used as, and various other vessels being used as surface raiders. Now, those work in a scenario where there's not a lot of escorts going around and you can't convoy everywhere. But if you have more escorts built, you're going to get more convoys. Because let's be honest, what kind of escort do you need for a convoy in the Indian Ocean in 1939, 1940? Well, probably a couple of sloops with it would be enough. Because let's be honest, whilst the Hilfscruiser might well win the fight versus the sloop, it might well. While it's fighting a couple of sloops, it could well get damage itself, and it's probably going to see the merchant ship scatter to get away from it. And probably the friendly on-station cruiser is going to be coming towards them at full frigating speed to go, hello! And this cruiser, in this later period, is going to have, 9.2-inch guns? Automatic 9.2-inch guns? Or 12-inch guns? And there's no merchant ship which is being built anywhere near which can start dodging with them. Even if we consider traditionally what happens with some of the, the cruisers. In fact, one of them manages to sink let's be honest, it's an adapted Leander design, the Amphion class design, of the Australians. By luck or by judgment or circumstance, I've done a video about that on this channel. The reality is, if they'd been against something like a town class or bigger, and that's where most of the cruisers are going to be going in this scenario, they're not getting away with that. They're just that much bigger, that much more defensible, that much more survivable, that they are just going to muller them. And this is a problem. And again, you have, of course, the carriers. Now, Joel, you're right to an extent, but again, it's not just the reality, it's the perception of reality. Let me explain that one. Okay. So this one, I'm going to grab some more iron brew before I get into, because I'm going to need a drink after it. So, and this is the point at which I do something a little weird, but bear with me. Okay, so what we have when we're building and designing warships and we're designing fleets is we have reality versus perception of reality. You see, so X might be actually really strong, and Y might not be really strong in comparison to it. But if I believe Y can get away with it, because I've done a theoretical exercise, and let's say in terms of this this merchant cruiser, well, you see, because the merchant cruiser had its decks properly covered, so aircraft couldn't see it. Aircraft couldn't work out it wasn't a merchant ship, and it was flagged as a neutral. Then I think I can get away with it, and I can avoid aircraft, and I can do it to get away from these ships. And it doesn't matter that there's increased land-based aircraft, etc. And the thing is about small wars and exercises versus major wars, is in a small war, which is going to be more mucky, and is going to have far more neutrals wandering around, and far less of an organised sphere, and far much of a grey area even at sea, you might be able to get away with it. And that then becomes your false positive. Now, I've talked about false positives and exercises before, and they're a big thing for the creation of weapons and systems which can have an effect on war. The classic example of false positive I use is the fact that during the exercises in the early 1930s and late 1920s, the aircraft, especially the Royal Air Force land-based aircraft, when they were attacking battle groups, would go after the battleships, the aircraft carriers, and the cruisers. They'd ignore the destroyers in the exercises. And this created the idea that was perpetrated into a lot of Royal Navy thinking, up until about 1936, when Henderson's managed to change their minds after 3 years of being Third Sea Lord, that aircraft weren't going to attack destroyers, and therefore destroyers primarily existed to help defend other ships, because aircraft, they weren't valuable enough targets for aircraft to go for. But you see, the thing is, in an exercise, if I die, I don't really die. I don't really lose my life. I'm not really risking anything in an exercise, and especially when you compare it to the actual general risk of flying and aviation in that time period, the number of crashes they had, realistically, it ain't gonna bother me much. So I might as well go for the bragging rights, and the bragging rights from sinking a destroyer are nil. The bragging rights from sinking a battleship are massive. So which am I gonna go for? So that skews the exercise. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, and I mentioned in other videos, you do have the scenarios that at sort of Midway and various other major battles in the Pacific, the American and Japanese carrier battle groups do aim for the largest prizes. They do aim for the centre of the battle groups. So they do sort of fit according to that exercise doctrine, exercise appearance. But they have been heavily trained to do that. And even then, quite a lot of their pilots and quite a lot of their air groups, and we often don't talk about this, drop off in 1s and 2s to go and attack destroyers because they're easier targets and on their way in. And they can attack something and then they can withdraw without loss of face. And it happens to all the air groups. It really does. I know. You want to get involved? Well, I will be using you as a demonstration in a second. Okay, just stand for a second. So, this is what we're talking about with false positives. They can have a big impact. And perception can. So whilst looking back, and even now as we're talking about this logically, we can say, look, these ships in this scenario would not work. They would be very quickly dead. In fact, I would say the whole surface raiding doctrine has an issue. The fact is, they still could get built, and they could still serve a useful purpose. Because guess what? The Soviets look at German surface raiding experience, they look at the British experience of focusing on against them, and they like the idea of surface raiders and Sveltov class, because even though they'll get killed, even though they will get taken down and killed, killing them requires you send forces to go and kill them. And so you have to send forces out of primary theatres into secondary or even tertiary theatres to hunt down these ships and kill them. And that's a distraction. So they can serve a purpose, even in their death, they can serve a purpose of distracting your forces off to go there, because you have to do it. Because if you're the major nation that provides security, provides strength to the world for its maritime trade and its all these things, if you do not hold up your end of the bargain, then others are going to potentially perceive you're weak, and you might not get the support you need. You might not get the assistance you need. You might not have the control of the circumstances you need to be able to properly exercise your plan and your war-fighting doctrine. And that's the reality we're talking about. Okay. Yes, there is a torpedo up there in front of the submarine plushie. Yes, that was me freestyling, but yeah. Occasionally I go into full standing in front of the room lecturer mode. Excuse me. Again, have you been mucking up my settings? I think he's been playing in my settings. Oh, you huggy boy. You huggy boy. You huggy boy. You huggy. You huggy. Ah, you're cool boy. The camera knows what we want, Raleigh. Oh. Again, Karl Magazbeck, you are completely right. Yes, the kamikaze often aim for destroyers as they'd have more of an impact on them. Cruisers they might bounce off the belt of. Joe Friedrichs, but again, does it matter they don't survive past the first mission? That's their purpose. As I said, they're already... In a nice way, they're assets you've already considered dead. And if you consider, throughout the Cold War, the Soviets maintained the Indian Ocean Squadron. Okay? What was the likelihood of the Indian Ocean Squadron getting home to the Soviet Union in any hot war? What was the likelihood that the nations were going to have to deal with it and cause trouble? And deal with it before it caused trouble? Quite high. And again, you might have assets in that theatre, but you might also be wanting to use them for something else. And if those assets in the secondary theatre can't be drawn off for something else, then you can't get together a larger fleet. Assets which are held in the secondary theatre are held in the secondary theatre. They're not able to be deployed to a primary theatre, and they're not able to be therefore there when you need to fight, let's say, a Battle of Matapan or something like that, where it might be useful to have some extra cruisers and an extra aircraft carrier. Because let's say all you're holding off in the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean are 3 light fleet carriers over the two spaces, and 6 or so heavy cruisers, 6 or so light cruisers, and a couple of dozen destroyers. That's still a couple of dozen destroyers. That's still 12 cruisers of various levels, and that's still 3 aircraft carriers, which you prefer to be in a primary theatre. And they could be being held there by a couple of ships being problematic. So that's a very useful, because if they're not... Again, think of it as this way. You're not you're not sinking the enemy ships, but you're holding them out of the decisive zone. So you can inflict more damage. You can maybe even have more chance of actually equaling force in terms of capability if you can hold enough of their forces in secondary theatres. It's both a likelihood the British and Americans already would have forces in secondary theatres. It's also a thing that the British and Americans would not like to keep their forces so heavily dominated in secondary theatres if they can avoid it. A lot of ships probably do disappear because, well, if World War II doesn't happen into various scenarios. Well, no, you can reduce those ships down. In a nice way, you can replace those ships with other ships, or you can reduce the number of those ships. Yes, you might like to keep them at full peacetime strength, but the reality is you're not going to. The reality is you're going to deal with the situation as is. And the thing is, you go, right, now I want to keep all these ships in the secondary theatre because that's best for my diplomacy and my presence. Or, I've had these ships damaged in the primary theatre, not even sunk, damaged, so they need to be replaced. They need to be repaired, and I need other ships to come in to take over their duties because of, being able to keep the mission tempo up and the operation tempo up. You're going to call them in, if you can. That's how life goes. You'd like to keep them in those spaces. You can't. Even the largest navies don't have an infinite resource of ships. This is what got me into trouble recently with a commenter, because I said, the US Navy wasn't as present in the Battle Atlantic as the Royal Canadian Navy. And people took me as that me being rude about the US. No, it's not. At times, the US Coast Guard was more present in the Battle Atlantic than the US Navy. Why? Because the US Navy don't have infinite destroyers and escorts to go around. And it's not the Royal Navy's providing enough, the Royal Canadian Navy's providing enough. They don't always need to be there. So they're concentrating their destroyers and their escort destroyers off in the Pacific. And yes, for certain operations, they bring a lot of them into the Atlantic. But they often keep quite a lot off in the Pacific. Because they don't need to be there, and they don't have infinite numbers, so they can't be everywhere they want to be. Sometimes they have to rely on their allies to do it, just like the British have to rely on them to do it. The British can afford to not send as much force as they'd like to send to the Pacific, because they don't have infinite forces either, so they can concentrate on the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. And in return, the Americans don't have to worry about sending as many forces as they'd like to the Atlantic, because they don't have infinite forces, and they can concentrate on the Pacific. That's what you do in an alliance, because you do not have infinite ships. And as much as the major powers would like to keep in secondary theatres and like to keep full strength in secondary theatres, the moment you have a war going on and you have primary theatres, you're going to see very quickly the best ships from the best ships go off, and then you're going to see other ships go off from the secondary theatres. That's the joy of it all. Anyway, with that being said, I'm going to do... yeah. This. That should now be auto-flicking through and just do any questions, which means I'm going to do this. And if you give me a second, actually, no, give me a second. Let's see if I can get the bot running. Let's see if we can get the bot running. Hey, I'm trying to get the paddle monkey working. Let's watch the chat, see if it turns on. It turns up in the chat. Yes, questions are now open. So hopefully if I open up the question section, your questions will come in. Now, if for those who are first time in the chat and they've never done questions before, don't worry, it's fairly easy. Just copy what's on the other people do. It basically, we have an auto system, so I don't lose questions if YouTube does anything funny. That should store the question. It stores the question in Discord, so I can quickly go and get them from the Battleships Q&A, so I don't lose them there. Thank you, Seneca Nero. Got your test in. Right. Okay. You want to come? You? Oh, God, you're such a poodle. Oh, you are such a poodle. Right then. Oh, good lord. All right. All righty then. Oh. Lovely. Go on my lap and just cough on me. Like rumba. Won't all this propulsion improvement in a navy for stuff affect the air and land force in some ways? Given whatever navy improves will ripple into other areas. Yeah, they'll all be impacted. You know, in nicest way. I've concentrated on navies because I know them best. I'm not talking about land and air force and how they're impacted. Again, I wouldn't be surprised to see as the first jet aircraft you see on medium bombers. On land, I really wouldn't be surprised if the first jet aircraft you see on medium bombers rather than fighters, judging by the Air Ministry, in terms of Britain and other nations. I'd also say with the Royal Navy, I wouldn't be surprised if they end up going for high pressure boilers, being forced down that route, because it was coming anyway. So it's going to be pushed down that route, but yeah. This propulsion stuff, all this development stuff will affect things, and yeah, it will ripple, and it will ripple from other areas as well. This is one of the points you have to consider in this, that there will be unending ripples. A lot of development, a lot of improvement. And think about this. Well, think about chain home, but think about it expanded. Imagine if Australia built a version of chain home on their northern coast. Or, you know, Canada built a version of chain home, or, you know, various others. You know, that you could see that exported out. You could see various parts of the empire getting their own radar air defense network built in place, etc. Because, nice way, once Britain's built that in the UK, they're going to start expanding it out. They're going to start spreading out because it's a great defensive asset. And if it's peacetime, you have the capacity to do so. You're not constantly replacing parts in the UK as well as trying. You've got the space and the time to expand production. You can do these things. And if you consider the Shadow Factory program is already well underway and starting up in 1939, if you got a decade to prepare, goodness knows what you end up with. You know, a massive amount of rearmament going on. A massive amount of development as well. Hello. Right. I was just pressing a button. You don't have to get down if you don't want to. What are you doing? Oh! 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 Give me a second. Oh! If I was a nasty person, I'd step on yours so you'd feel that like that sometimes. Right in the plums. Yeah. Okay. Okay, next question. Matthew Kelling, do you think any of the jet flying boats get into service in the 50s in time? I wouldn't be surprised. Because, in a nice way, as I said, I think wacky aircraft get into service. And in this timeline, you've got a lot of reasons for wacky aircraft to get into service. A lot of reasons for wacky aircraft to get into service. There'll be a lot of reasoning behind the wacky aircraft getting into service. And jet flying boats. You see, one of the things that happens during World War II is there's a massive construction of infrastructure for aircraft. Without the impetus of war, will there be as much of a massive construction? It probably will be coming slowly, but it won't be as quickly and won't be as widespread. And so flying boats might well last a bit longer, and jet flying boats might seem more of a practical capability to have. Might seem. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if something like the Saunders Row ends up in service. Joe Fredericks, would navies even bother modernizing older battleships? It seems to me adding radar, replacing guns, rockets is more expensive than just building new one. I reckon you would see more of a building new of replacing. I think you're probably going to see newer battleships replaced. I don't think... This is going to sound strange. I don't see many of the World War I vintage battleships actually lasting out the 1940s at all. Even the modernized ones, I don't see them lasting too long in service. If you consider Britain could theoretically replace all its battleships and get to 24 at a pace of 4 entering service roughly a year. 3 years starting one, then they're starting next ones at the 2-year mark. It's sort of after about a year or so, and onwards from that. So you could be talking 9-10 years. They've replaced them all. And they've all gone. Realistically, they've all gone. So you're dealing with newer ships, and you might be talking about refitting, repairing ships which are about 10 years old in the 1950s with no modernizing equipments, but. Yeah, that's what you're going to be dealing with, not the really old World War I generation of ships. Seneca Nero, how would the world react to Yamato in this world? With it being revived as an outdated ship. Revealed as an outdated ship. It wouldn't be revealed as an outdated ship. It would be a 27-knot ship, but it's the 18-inch guns, and I already did a whole section talking about the battleships about how that would have an impact, so I'll leave that to go back to earlier in the video, and I'll get on with the questions. IO, where do you reckon the inflection point is where navies stop building battleships in favour of carriers and large multi-missile armed cruisers? It's going to be a long way down the road. I think you're first going to have battleships move from the primary offensive weapon to the primary defensive weapon, and shore bombardment and secondary roles. But I think probably about the 1960s is when you could start to really see battleships disappear without any form of replacement. I think you'll see reductions in numbers in the 1950s, but I think you won't see. You'll start to see them. You won't start to see them actually being not replaced till the 1960s, and it's going to depend on various factors because they might even stay around as the primary escort. It's going to depend how the world has changed. And if you haven't had a moment which has seen the carrier become the dominant, as you've had in World War II, a big major moment which has illustrated it, then it's almost harder to let it go. Because it is the big status symbol in everyone's mind, and there is something visceral about having that many thousand tons of steel and guns turn up and look at you and go, hello. So yeah, it's going to be more. It's going to be even more gradated than it was historically. It's going to be even more graduated, and that's going to have an impact as well because the longer battleships are being built, the more they're going to be modernized, the more they're going to be adapted to the circumstances, the more likely they are going to be looked at and going, well, actually, they are viable, sort of. So it's going to be interesting. Joel Fredericks, would the concept of an intercontinental bomber even exist? I understand Hitler wanted an American bomber, but for the same militaries, would you be able to argue for such a development? Yes. In fact, most of the independent air forces would be arguing for such a capability as it's their ability to, how do I put this, argue best against navies. Their best defense in treasury battles is a good offense, and the best having the ability to go, well, we can reach other continents. You don't just need a navy to do it. We can do it. Is a good argument for you. So think of things like the American bomber in this scenario as far more about yes, they give you a realistic they do give you a capability, but they're also about winning treasury battles. Ultimately, it always comes down to a treasury battle. 1981. With war holding off and all this new construction, do the Royal Navy's type system ever come about at all? Later on, probably. There are discussions. Historically, they come about because it was a way to standardize and work things out in a sort of early NATO scenario when the types were accorded with various early NATO designations, etc. There is a possibility of something similar, but at this point, they're still quite happy with the names of things, and they know what they have the meanings of what they are, and they're happy with corvette, frigate, sloop, destroyer, or rather escort destroyer, tribal class destroyer, aka destroyer leader, aka full fat destroyer, light cruiser, and heavy cruiser, and all those, and all the various things in between. So probably not. Yeah, probably it's still come around to potential in the future, but not at this point. Paul Amos, do you see the introduction of new naval treaties mid to late 1940s if there's no significant war for 1940s, as the escalating cost to all the countries could become unsustainable? No. And the reason for that is there are some nations which, once they're out of treaty, are never going back in them again. Is there a treaty you think that you could hold Stalin to? Is there a treaty you think you can design that you're going to hold Hitler to? Even Mussolini, once he's free of the treaty, let alone Japan. And the trouble is also, once you've let the technology cats out of the bag, that's going to create enough of a tech race, a qualitative race going on, that there's going to be problems with trying to put in a treaty limitations, because you could find yourself unintentionally giving the advantage to someone else. Once the treaty gloves are off, it's going to be very hard to put them back on. Very hard to put them back on. as much as nations might desire them. There's also going to be the reality that do nations have the level of trust in this scenario for the treaties to work? The thing is, the treaties work to an extent while there's a great level of trust post World War I between all the nations involved. If there's not enough trust, then the treaties aren't going to work. You can look up at the biscuits all you like, but you're not getting any more, because you'll get tubby and fat. Yes, you're 32.2 kilograms. Which, for those who aren't quite sure what that equates to in imperial. Wow. It's about 70 pounds. No. Down. You're supposed to not be. You're supposed to be a bit lighter than that. Kalmagazberg. Do you see a serious Yugoslav Navy in this scenario? Without details, of course. There's a potential for it. There's always a potential for it, but it's gonna be a case of, if they start pushing down that route, is that become a war scenario with Italy? Because does Italy fancy anyone having another navy in the Adriatic other than them? And that's a problem. San Canero, 3874. For submarine tenders, would below surface docking be a good idea for covert tenders? Doubtful. Doubtful. It's going to add a whole tech issue which you don't need to. It's far easier to park them. Remember, I don't see satellites coming about any sooner than they did historically. There's always a possibility, but it's very unlikely. Werner von Braun might really kickstart its development, and others might be copying it, but you know, it's doubtful you're going to end up with satellites anytime sooner. And then why do you need a covert submarine tender? Okay, maybe you make a Hilf cruiser if you're the Germans like that, so the submarine can dock at sea with you. But again, that's going to be a very difficult issue, and having a moon pool that large enough for that to be useful and practical is going to be horrendous. So, no one who's doing it practically. Joel Fredericks, in terms of reactors, originally for the Manhattan, it was not an issue of finance, but rather resources. Precious metals from the Treasury, uranium from Congo. So can a civilian project even succeed? Again, it's going to depend on the funding. It's going to depend on the people being interested and the finance and the support being there. If you get the right politicians, then as Charlie Wilson showed with Afghanistan, if you get the right people in the right places prepared to make the right arguments, amazing things can happen. Kenry, do any navies develop amphibs like LSTs? The navy which is working most on amphibious warfare at this point is the Royal Navy. They are actually working towards something like an LPD, landing platform dock, for their landing craft. And some of the early ideas for what would basically be an LPD are already on design drawing boards in 1939. So you could see something like that coming out. The Japanese are also on that route. So landing platform docks are things that you could be sort of seeing coming about. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans have them somewhere. I know I've found copies of theirs, but I would not be surprised if the Americans were also working on that in some places. Joel Fredericks, how long do you think Goering can prevent carrier development in Germany without a war? It's actually far more difficult for him to hold it up without a war. With a war, he can talk pressures and etc. various things. Without a war, it's actually more difficult for him to hold it up because once the carrier's in service and the Kriegsmarine turn round to the Chancellery, to the Führer, and go, well, we have an aircraft carrier, Herr Hitler. We unfortunately have no aircraft for it, as Herr Goering has yet to supply them. Herr Goering can maybe bluff that out once. He can't bluff it out a second time. So, yeah. Twitch test from Runon. Steve Clarke. Gas turbines in warships. Which class first? Oh, that's probably longer down the line because it's going to be a lot of development, but it'll be destroyers first. They're the ones for whom the gas turbines make the most sense. Joe Fredericks, do you think an assignment because of Battleship would ever be retired? As said, I think it could be wound down, and I think probably in the 60s it would be reduced, but there is part of me which wonders if the major navies ever do get rid of them, or if they always keep a couple around for status. It would be really interesting to see how that would work out. And especially if there is a big war in the 50s and they prove very useful in it. Let's put it this way. If the battleships which are produced in late 40s, early 50s, and there's a war in the 50s, and they have better air defense, and they have missiles and things on them, and they do better, and it isn't the scenario you have, and they are a major part of task groups, and they operate with the carriers and all those things, then there's going to be a good argument for keeping them. It's not going to be the same watershed moment. So there is an argument it might not be. Paul Amos. Considering that a number of weapons developments that occurred early in World War II due to the needs of war, how much slower would development take if there isn't a significant war before 1950s? There's a lot more research done. So let's put it this way. There are going to be weapons coming in, but the research level is going to push on, so you're probably going to have the cycles of weapon systems come in as they did historically, roughly every 3 to 4 years. So if you consider if war holds off from 1939 to, let's say, 1952, you have about 3 weapon cycles take place in that period. Are they going to be the same weapons which came about historically? No. In some ways they'll probably be better, in some ways they'll probably be not as good. But they probably have about 3 cycles of weapons. Bidziak. Do you see anything silly carrier-wise happening, like the through-deck cruisers the USN was working in the 50s, or the crazy battle carriers that were kicking around? I don't think the battle carriers happen, but there is part of me which wonders if the American response to light fleet carriers could be through-deck cruisers. That they were working on. There is part of me which does wonder if they do go to cruiser carrier route, and I'm just saying that because the USN, as said, I think the USN will be short of destroyers in comparison to other navies in peacetime, because of the Senate's ability to ignore ordering destroyers in this period. And yeah, that's going to be an interesting thing. And then we have the last question so far received, although a couple of new questions have been discussed. How do you see surface raiders, hill cruisers developing in this timeline? Honestly, much the same as they did historically, taking small ships which are sort of fast enough and long range enough, and trying to hide as many weapons and other systems on them as possible to make them useful for supporting surface raiders. They are an offset strategy. They're not a sensible strategy, they are an offset strategy. It's kind of like the French hiring privateers during the Age of Sail wars versus the British. You do it because you want to tie up British resources, not because they're going to win you the war. Wilson Triples, you've got a space between the exclamation mark and the question, so that's not gone through. For Germany, do you think Joe Fredericks? For Germany, do you think Hitler would still prioritize battleships over carriers, or would he eventually be convinced to switch to carrier-based force? Oh, he'll prioritize battleships. He's obsessed with the size of guns. He's a dictator. Tater. Eventually he could end up with carriers, but that's if you think he survives long enough. I would say, personally, without wars, and especially if he doesn't have the successes he does, that Hitler's days could be more numbered than Roosevelt's. That's my personal estimation, but honestly, the system Hitler's created, there are far more threats to him than there are to Roosevelt in America. And of course, Britain, we've got Chamberlain, probably not followed by Churchill, probably followed by maybe Halifax, honestly, eventually. But, you know, these things will happen. These leadership positions will happen. And possibly even later on Anthony Eden. And we all know how great he was in the Suez Crisis. So yeah, there's all sorts of interesting leadership changes which is going to happen, but I think for Hitler, I think he'll prioritize battleships because ego size, and because fundamentally Hitler is trapped in the First World War in his analysis of navies. He really is. New IQB 447, new IQB. Where's the 4472 come from? That gone. Does anyone try to use a cruiser carrier as a merchant raider in this timeline? Oh, I don't think so, because I think the people who are going to have light fleet carriers are not going to be the types who are going to do that. The Japanese don't believe in breaking up their concentration of force. That's just not sensible for Japan. They don't have enough force to be able to break it up. And I don't think the small nations are going to have them to do that. I don't see either Britain or America going that policy. Britain tends to use its cruisers to hoover up, so they'll probably use the light fleet carriers as part of the hoovering up of enemy merchant ships. And the Americans don't really do that sort of thing. Io, do you think the Royal Navy would still start developing the concept of a command cruiser in this timeline? Or would they focus more on the light carriers and CVs? I think probably they develop let's put it this way. If you're building the light fleets in this timeline, they probably have more space for a fighter for command and control and a more normal flag deck because of for spacing, etc. So they probably are more normally built, as you would expect a vessel that size. But you could still see the command cruiser route going down. But you're also going to have far bigger cruisers to do it. I don't think you're going to have something like a Dido being used. As I said, I don't think the small cruisers are going to be around for long. I think the Didos are going to be a one batch and out, and I don't think the Atlantis are even going to get as many as they did historically. I think they'll be replaced by destroyers. I think you'll have far larger cruisers going around. And that's going to be the interesting thing, what the large cruisers are used for. Wilson Triplets. Hello. Do you think if war doesn't break out until 1950, do the Allies take a less favourable stance to the communist powers with the rise of communist China and other puppets instead of Asia Axis? Yes and no. I do think if war doesn't break out to 1950... depending on what the Japanese are also doing in China at the time, you might well find it far more of a proxy war going on in China in terms of supplying the Chinese. It's a really interesting scenario, but I could see the British both supplying oil to Japan to fight the Soviets, whilst also supplying arms to Chiang Kai-shek. And I could see America continuing to supply arms to Chiang Kai-shek, whilst also doing other things, and the Soviets probably trying to supply arms to the communist forces and trying to get them to attack the Japanese in China and all sorts of things. So yeah, I could see China basically turning into a bit of a quagmire in this scenario. Joe Friedrichs, for the smaller navies, do you think they might buy light carriers from the major navies, or would they focus on coastal operations to support a land-based aircraft? That's going to be the interesting thing. You see, I could see some navies, like the Dutch, maybe buying a light fleet carrier. Maybe. I could also see them deciding they've got to build their own for independent capability. I can definitely, as said, my suspicion with the British with the light fleets is they'll develop them first to allow them to rapidly grow their carrier numbers until they get all the fleet carriers they want online, and then they'll be start selling them off to the Dominions, and maybe they build batch 2 when they realise actually they're kind of useful to support cruisers and support cruiser operations. But there again, the Dominions might provide them in it. If you consider, if the Australians have a couple of light fleet carriers, they're probably acting as the cruiser carriers to support the cruiser operations in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Same with the Canadian ones in the North Atlantic, and potentially also in the Pacific, and various things like that. So you might have the South African ones providing the support for operations in the South Atlantic and those sort of things. So there are options with these assets if they've been handed over to the Dominions. Take care, Calvin, as I spoke. And Joel Fredericks. If the KMT wins the war, what navy do you think China could even afford, let alone operate? Oh, that's an interesting question. If the KMT do win the war, then, and I forgot to do this and this, then realistically, if they win the war, they probably start off by ordering some cruisers and then work their way up from there. That's what they've got to do. They're going to work their way up from there. Anyway, with that being said, oh, Mark, you just got it in. Questions are closed, but I will copy and paste Mark's question in so that we don't lose it. And that'll be the last question from Mark Claremont. And that's be the last question for tonight. Mark Charbois? No, I'm sure. Would a major naval conflict in the 50s not resemble India versus Pakistan in 71? I.e. new tech and theories, but not combat proven. Yes, but there again, that's also quite a large chunk of World War II as well. There would be a lot of interesting technology in there, a lot of interesting theories, a lot of exercise-based ideas, and a lot of people getting taken out when the theory doesn't hold up to reality. Anyway, that being said, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you look forward to the premiere. And, well, I'm going to say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, and supporting the channel. Thank you for helping it grow. There's brew ships on Sunday. Tomorrow there's a class, the Unreal class is coming out. And then there's going to be another interesting video on Saturday, which I should finish editing and upload tomorrow. And yeah, I'll be on Discord in a bit. Probably give me about 25 minutes or so to get to Discord. I'm going to sort out the fluffy puppy and various other things and check sure everyone's okay. But thank you very much for being here. Hope you enjoyed and look forward to chatting to you in a bit. And with that being said, what do we have coming up? Well, let's see. We have alternate history of Admirals Fisher and Henderson job swap. How does each do as third Sea Lord and the other's place? That's, if I'm not mistaken, that is Saturday's video. Next Thursday's video is Japan gets the German synthetic oil production method as part of its alliance in the 1930s, which will be fun to listen to. And that's, of course, going to be the same night I'm going to be live in London talking about procuring for peace and how conflict management and deterrence should be part of naval procurement. Also, what we've got coming up, well, we have next week Andrew Cunningham, Master of Confusion. Are you trying to take my fluffy puppy away? He might not go willingly.
No.
Yeah. And, yeah. that's what's coming out. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and hope to see you all soon on another video. Take care, everyone.